So I'm going to just put out my two premises as I start here with our policy advice to the governor. The first is that Massachusetts is a very small state in a very big world, and that climate change is obviously a global problem. And that's not to say that what we do is insignificant. I think as Jim alluded to, that there's definitely a role for leadership. And the city of Boston has led, and Massachusetts has led, but unfortunately we have a lot more leading to do. The second premise of my recommendations is that the science is indeed accurate, that it may even be conservative. So far, all of the predictions that our climate scientists have been making have actually been right in terms of what will be happening, but wrong in terms of when the effects have been happening much more rapidly than the scientists predicted. But I'm going to actually throw some numbers at you guys. Who here has heard about 350? Raise your hand. Okay, and who's here heard about 80% by 2050? Okay, those are kind of the two rallying cries of the climate movement, which I think shows you a problem right there. They're not particularly sexy things that you want to take to the streets to shout for. But I'm going to actually walk back from both of those numbers. I don't have slides, so we're going to do a little bit of board work. Can you guys still hear me if I'm talking back here, back in the back? Can you hear me? Great. So first we're going to do the 80% by 2050. So this is on the assumption that we can continue to have carbon dioxide go to climb in the atmosphere to 450 parts per million. And associated with the 450 parts per million is a 2 degrees Celsius rise in temperatures. So that's 450. Now, I actually have a very big problem with this number because this number actually comes from the 2007 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, report. That's the report, that's the group of scientists where they got the smartest scientists in the world to come together in the late 80s, and they have put out now 4 reports. In their 4th report, they weren't empowered to make policy recommendations, but they were able to lay out different policy paths without passing judgment on any of them. And in the 450 report, they said in the 2007 report, they said if we wanted to have a 50% chance of avoiding hitting the 450 parts per million and having a 2 degrees Celsius rise in temperature, which most scientists agree is the worst effects of climate change, if we want to avoid the worst effects of climate change, we need to reduce our emissions. Should have, sorry. It's a bit of a big one here. So for the 50% chance, we need to reduce our emissions 25 to 40% by 2020, and 80 to 95% by 2050. So that's the bottom of the range at having a 50% chance of avoiding this pretty bad situation. 50% chance. And that's the long-term thing. What we really care about is not the flow of emissions at any given point, but the total stock in the atmosphere, the total amount of emissions that are in the atmosphere. So the short-term targets are absolutely essential, because if we've been emitting like this, and this is 2050, this is 80% by 2050, there's 2 ways we can go there. We can take the nice gradual way to go there, or we can take a nosedive way to go there. If we take the nosedive way, all of this extra carbon is no longer in the atmosphere. If we wait, then we're still emitting, because we're not reducing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, we're reducing the amount of carbon we're putting into the atmosphere. So the short-term target is absolutely essential, absolutely essential. And for some reason, the advocacy community writ large has completely decided that the short-term target is unfeasible, we're never going to hit it politically, so they've been focusing all of their efforts on this long-term target and picking the bottom of the range of the long-term target. And to further complicate things, more recent evidence has come out now saying that 450 is not, in fact, the target, that 350 parts per million is actually the highest level. This is a report that's put out by, I believe, 12 scientists recently. The lead author is James Hansen, who's the top climate scientist at NASA, the first guy who rang the alarm bell about climate change decades ago. And his report suggests that if we wanted to have a life on Earth similar to that on which, if we wanted to have a planet similar to that on which life on Earth has adapted and which civilization has developed, we need to make sure that carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are not above 350 parts per million. And right now, Massachusetts is picking our 2020 target of between 10 to 25% by 2020, and at least 80% by 2050. If we pick the 25% number, we will be the most aggressive state in the country. And we will be at the very bottom of the 50% chance of hitting the outdated target. and that qualifies as leadership in this country, which is very frustrating. Bringing in the intergenerational, I'm sorry for moving around so much, but the camera's having a hard time following me. For the intergenerational equity and for what generational legacy we are leaving, we're doing a pretty half-assed job, pardon my French. So that's where we are. And just to give you a sense of what 350 looks like, James Hansen has suggested that, all right, so if you get just a little bit more background on the numbers, for basically all of human civilization, we were around 260 to 280 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. Right now, since the Industrial Revolution, that number is shot up. We're actually at 390 right now. We're increasing by about 2 parts per million a year. But as the economy continues to grow, as developing countries continue to grow and emit more and more, the number's accelerating. Some reports suggest we could be at 600, 700, 800, 900 by the end of the century if current growth trajectories remain the way they're headed. And just to let you know, the history of the Earth, in terms of the paleoclimatic data, suggests that the last time we know for sure we were above 300 parts per million was back in the Eocene era, about 35 million years ago. At that point, there were palm trees in Wyoming and crocodiles in the Arctic. It was a very, very different world. And granted, there are some other factors that feed into this, and we're not going to suggest we're going to start seeing that anytime soon. But in terms of the generational legacy, that's the direction we're heading. There's a lag time between all these things, but it could get very ugly faster than we might like. And certainly faster than we were able to adapt. Most of these climatic changes in the past have occurred over the period of millennia. 10,000 year shift is considered pretty rapid. We're trying to do this in a century or two, which is not recommended, although we don't have a user manual for the planet. But Hansen said that if we want to avoid 350, we need to stop burning coal across the entire world by 2030. That's our deadline, because coal is the most abundant source and the cheapest source of fossil fuels. If you look at the oil we've seen in the Gulf, how far we're drilling now down, because we are past the point where cheap oil is readily accessible. And we're also, for oil, where there's something called the energy return on investment, the energy return on energy invested, where before, in order to get a unit of energy, if you spent 1 unit of energy drilling down in Texas, you'd have the oil guys are shooting up, you get like 100 units of energy back for every unit of energy you put in. Now we're down to like 4 or 5 from what I hear, units of energy return on a unit of energy we put in. So eventually those financials are going to catch up to us pretty quickly. But that's an entirely separate issue. So again, sorry for the tangent. 2030, we need the whole world to stop burning coal. And we also can't go after a lot of the unconventional stuff that remains, the oil, the natural gas, the tar sands, the oil shales. We can burn a lot of the other stuff if we don't go after that really unconventional stuff. But working back from this, if we want the entire world to stop burning coal by 2030, I would argue that developed countries like the United States need to stop burning coal before countries like China and India, who are still dealing with significantly impoverished populations. I would suggest that the US and the developed world should aim for about 2020, which is a very aggressive and ambitious target, considering that there are some states in our country, like West Virginia, that get about 97% of their electricity from coal. But again, I'm just going with the numbers here and the science. You guys can fight me on this and say, well, maybe we should do 2025, maybe we should do 2030, maybe we should disregard the brightest climate scientists at NASA and say, let's stop burning coal by 2050. But again, these are numbers that I did not make up. I would encourage you to check these on your own if you don't believe me. So I would suggest, as the first policy recommendation to our governor, that we in Massachusetts aim to phase out coal by 2015. In line with the science, there are 4 coal plants remaining in Massachusetts. There's 1 in Salem, 2 down in Somerset, and 1 out in western Massachusetts, Mount Tom. They're all very old plants. They're built to last 30 years. They're in their 40th, 50th, 60th years. We are actually very, very lucky in that regard. There are 2 New England states, Rhode Island and Vermont, that have no coal plants at the present. There are 2 more in New Hampshire and 2 in Connecticut. I think Maine has some smaller ones that are not used for commercial retail. But we have the ability, the governor's own projections suggest that we can replace 25% of our electricity consumption can be completely eliminated through efficiency alone. Coal makes up 25% of our electricity consumption. So I say let's barrel ahead with efficiency and try to stop burning coal as soon as we can to try to take that leadership role. The second recommendation I would make to the governor, going back to these numbers here, is that if you recall, Massachusetts has a chance between 10 to 25%. It is what the government is empowered to select. So naturally, the 25% would be criminal not to choose that. But beyond that, the state consultants actually put out a report suggesting that we can get 35% reductions by 2020 on a cost-effective basis. And that doesn't include the externalities of fossil fuels, the health costs, or the job creation benefits. That's purely looking at dollar-for-dollar investments in our own efficiency and renewable infrastructure. Cost at little to no cost, we can get 35% by 2020. So I would suggest that we take the 35% number and land ourselves somewhere in the middle there. Which again might give us a little bit more of a shot at the 450 number, but still falls fairly short of the 350. And the nice thing about the bill that, for some reason I'm screaming my head about this, but no one else seems to be paying attention. The bill actually says at least 80% by 2050. So I would suggest that we go carbon neutral, 100% by 2050. To take that leadership role and have Massachusetts pledge to be the first carbon neutral state in the country. Norway has set a goal of around 2035. Costa Rica, New Zealand, I think Monaco as well have all pledged to go carbon neutral themselves. All aiming in the 2030 range. They're in a race to do that, so 2050 is not that aggressive for carbon neutrality. But on other, so the 2 other policy recommendations I would give to Governor Patrick and may give to him. First off, there's a carbon fee and dividends. Have you guys heard about this? Also known as a carbon tax and dividends. That's the scary word for it. A carbon tax and dividend, basically the idea is you put a price on carbon and then you give the money back. So the government artificially increases the price of carbon to incentivize all of the efficiency work we need to do, all the renewable energy investment that we need to do, all of the land use change we need to do to let the market drive that change of the American entrepreneurial spirit, drive us in that direction by having an accurate price so that the price that we charge for burning fossil fuels accurately reflects the cost to society. And just one general note about this parts per million stuff. If we go to 800 here, or whatever, this doesn't come down quickly. We're talking hundreds, thousands of years some of that CO2 is going to stay in the atmosphere. So think about how many generations are going to be paying for our sins if we don't step up to the plate and take the type of action we need to take. But so carbon fee and dividend, basically, you have the price of carbon rise up and up and up, and then you give that money back on a per capita basis so that no one is forced to disproportionately bear the burden of a higher price of electricity. But everyone has an incentive to drop their own individual electricity consumption as fast as they can because you get the same amount of money back no matter how much energy you use. So if if your electricity bill goes up $20 a month, but you're getting $30 a month back because you're a low user, you drop that further down so that you're, you get $30 a month no matter how much you use. You get that $30 a month back. So if you're able to do it so that I'm just confusing myself, I'm sorry. Long story short, everyone's got incentive to reduce their own consumption no matter how much energy you use, because you get a certain amount back regardless of your energy use. And at the same time, then renewables are suddenly much more cost effective compared to fossil fuels because the price is higher. But again, no one's really having to pay that much more for it because we're giving the money back on a per capita basis to citizens, and I would argue a per employee basis to businesses. So the businesses have an incentive to continue having jobs and not laying off people and shutting the lights off, but that for every employee they have, they get a certain cut of that money, so that businesses are not also bearing the burden of this disproportionately. And the beautiful thing about that, again, is just it lets us go as fast as the market will allow us to go, and no faster. The downside to the cap system, which seems to be embraced so far, is that not only does this, if you set a cap of saying we're going to reduce our emissions by 25%, so we want to have this many emissions left, it basically sets both a ceiling and a floor at the same time in terms of how much carbon is going to be emitted, because you're selling these credits. And the lowest credit, if there's demand for it, will sell for a penny. So you're going to have, someone's going to buy it because it's going to be cheap. Whereas, if you put a price on carbon and just let it go up and up and up and up and up, you're going to drive that innovation, and there's not going to be any minimum number of credits floating out there for people to purchase. One other novel suggestion I would propose, this is the only one that I can personally claim the credit for, is to have a price on carbon, again, a much smaller price. The purpose is less to drive behavioral choices and to drive purchasing choices, but more to create a revenue stream and basically to have that pot of money. So you're talking, $1 per ton emitted or 50 cents per ton emitted, and collect all that money and put it into a fund that you could use to do workforce training for individuals who work in fossil fuel plants, and to do community redevelopment assistance for communities that host fossil fuel facilities, and to have this fund grow larger and larger and larger and larger and larger over time, so that when communities are looking at closing down the coal plants or the natural gas facilities that exist in their communities, there's a continually larger pot of money for them to pull from to both change that piece of land that they have in their community to something more beneficial to the community, and also to retrain their workers. So it creates a better feedback loop for us. Because all these things that the natural systems were very much working against us, where we started heading this direction, we're just going to go faster and faster on our own because of all the natural feedback loops, which you don't have time to discuss. The one thing I do want to close on is just a lot of numbers behind me, a lot of graphs. I'm sorry for making this very technical, but to bring this back to the human dimension, we saw this summer two very potent examples of the world that we're moving into. The first is in Russia, where Russia had heat waves that were completely unheard of in Moscow, where you need vodka to stay warm in the winters. They were having, for the first time in their entire history, 100 degree plus weather. And initially, people just turned their fans, and the few people who had air conditioning turned it on. The air conditioners got sold out of the stores. And then, because it was so hot and so dry, the forest started burning. And all of the smoke from the forest started drafting into the city of Moscow. And again, no one has air conditioning in Moscow. So people were basically stuck with a choice of shutting their windows and baking inside their houses, or opening their windows and letting the smoke filter in. There were about 800 deaths per day over the course of a couple-week heat wave there, from either smoke inhalation or heat exhaustion, because what do? The embassies located in Moscow encouraged their workers to leave the city until it cooled off. Some of the more rich Muscovites fled, but that's example number one. Example number two, in Pakistan, we saw massive flooding, and just, warm air holds water much better than cold air. And the total number of people affected by the floods in Pakistan, 20% of the country was underwater at one point. And the total number of people who were affected, who got kicked out of their homes, who had both this year's and next year's harvest destroyed because of the depth of damage to the crops, was more than the people who were affected by the Haitian earthquake and the Asian tsunami combined. And international aid levels were way low because we've been inundated with natural disasters recently. It barely made the news compared to a lot of other things. But Pakistan is not a country you want to live in before this stuff happened. It was not particularly well developed. There's obviously some shaky democracy going on there, and some warfare. But now they're going to spend the next decade, as Bill McKibben puts it, crawling back to where they were this spring before this disaster occurred. And one other point on the heat wave, which should make you worried, is that Russia is the world's third largest producer of grain in the world. Third largest exporter of grain in the world, sorry. Probably producer as well. And because they had such horrible harvests associated with this heat wave, the Russian government decided to stop exporting grain this summer, period. It said, we're keeping the grain we've got for our people. And the press's reaction to this was, don't worry anybody, that's fine. The US and Australia, the top 2 grain producers in the world, both had good harvests. So no need to worry. Which is true for this year. But what happens in 2 years, or 3 years, or 5 years, to say nothing of 50 years or 100 years, when both Russia and the US have massive heat waves? And we both decide we're going to keep what food we've got for ourselves. And we've got all these countries in the world that rely upon imports of food to feed their people. What type of governments are we going to have? What type of society, what type of civilization will we have if we can't count on basic supplies of food and water for our citizens? Sorry to leave you on the note of doom and gloom, but the good news is that there is a movement out there. I would encourage you all to join it. This is the most important thing I think you could be doing with your lives. And there's lots of great organizations to check out. I would start with 350.org as one to start off, but be happy to answer more questions as we go on.